President Trump's tariffs take effect, various industries share, in their own words, the impact on their operations and their bottom lines. As we head out to break, we take a look at the auto industry and how it's being affected by tariff policy.
Is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States.
25% tariffs that the president announced on imported cars as well as parts starting next week.
For some automotive industry economists, the unthinkable has happened. 30 years of free trade across North America virtually wiped out by a single executive order.
Of course, I don't think any.
Picture this. It's Monday morning in Detroit. The factory gates are locked. Workers stand outside, staring at a piece of paper that just ended their livelihood. 50,000 American jobs gone overnight. Assembly lines are silent. Families who have worked in those factories for generations are suddenly asking themselves, what just happened? And the answer is simple. Africa happened. For the first time in history, 5 of Asia's largest automakers, household names that powered America's middle class for decades, have turned their backs on the United States and chosen Africa as their new home. Not Mexico, not Europe, not Southeast Asia. Africa, the continent once dismissed as too risky and too poor, is now the epicenter of the global automotive revolution. Let that sink in. Factories that once fueled Detroit's pride are now being built in Accra, Lagos, and Nairobi. Car engines are rolling off lines not in Michigan but in Africa's industrial parks, and it's not charity, it's business. These automakers ran the numbers, studied the future, and decided that Africa was the place where their money would grow, their technology would flourish, and their next generation of customers would be waiting. This is not a small shift, this is a global earthquake. For decades, America was the symbol of the car industry. Cars were not just machines. They were part of the American identity, the proof of industrial strength. But today, that symbol is cracking. What was once the beating heart of U.S. economic power is being transplanted to Africa, and Washington can do nothing to stop it. Imagine the panic in the White House Situation Room. Advisors scrambling to explain how 5 automakers, some with American headquarters for over 50 years, just walked away. Politicians shouting about tariffs, sanctions, and Buy American campaigns, while investors quietly move their money out of the U.S. market and into Africa's. Rising economies. And here's the most shocking part: this didn't happen overnight. Africa prepared for this moment. While the world underestimated the continent, African nations were quietly building industrial zones, upgrading power grids, negotiating free trade agreements, and training millions of engineers, welders, and designers. They built an environment where automakers could do more than just assemble cars, they could innovate. This is why the automakers left the U.S. They saw a continent with a young, skilled workforce, governments hungry for growth, and consumers ready to buy the future. They saw cheaper energy, faster construction timelines, fewer regulatory roadblocks, and governments willing to partner with them, not strangle them with bureaucracy. And let's be honest, this is about more than cars. This is about power. This is about who controls the future of mobility, technology, and industry. America once believed it had a monopoly on that future. But today, that monopoly is broken. As we speak, new car plants are rising across Africa, capable of producing millions of vehicles every year. And not just any vehicles, electric vehicles, next-generation hybrids, cars powered by African-made batteries and African-mined lithium. The supply chain is shifting, the profits are shifting, and the geopolitical balance is shifting with it. This is why Washington is afraid, because if Africa can build cars, it can build everything else. It can build its own planes, its own ships, its own satellites, its own future. And the U.S. will no longer be able to control the flow of wealth, the flow of technology, or the flow of opportunity. This is not just about economics, it's about dignity. For decades, Africa has been the last link in the chain, the place where raw materials were dug up and shipped away to be turned into wealth somewhere else. Today, Africa is saying no more. If you want our resources, you will process them here. If you want our markets, you will build here. If you want our loyalty, you will respect us as equals. That is why this moment is so explosive, because it signals the beginning of something much bigger than a car deal. It signals the dawn of Africa's industrial revolution. It signals the end of an era where decisions in Washington and Wall Street determined Africa's destiny. And to every American listening, this is not just about lost jobs. This is about a lost advantage. This is about the U.S. realizing that the world is no longer waiting for it to lead. The rest of the world is moving fast. And Africa is no longer following, it is setting the pace. So buckle up, because what happens next will shake the entire global economy. The factories leaving America are just the first wave. The second wave will be tech companies, energy giants, logistics hubs, all choosing Africa as their headquarters for the future. And by the time Washington wakes up, it may already be too late. The world woke up this morning to an announcement that has sent shockwaves across Washington, Detroit, and Wall Street. 5 of Asia's biggest automakers titans that have been assembling, selling, and servicing cars in the United States for decades have just announced that they are moving billions of dollars worth of production to Africa. Factories in Ohio, Michigan, and Kentucky are preparing to shut down. 50,000 American workers have been told that their jobs will disappear within months. This is not just a business decision. This is a turning point in global economic history. For decades, America was the beating heart of the automobile industry. Detroit was called the Motor City. The American car was a symbol of freedom, pride, and innovation. But today, those very symbols are collapsing under the weight of their own. Arrogance and Africa is rising as the new frontier of automotive power. The announcement came from a joint press conference in Addis Ababa, where executives from Toyota, Hyundai, Tata Motors, Kia, and Suzuki sat shoulder to shoulder with African leaders from Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa. They smiled as they unveiled a $120 billion investment package that will see new mega assembly plants built across the African continent. These are not just assembly lines, they are entire automotive ecosystems, including local parts manufacturing, battery production, and research centers for electric and autonomous vehicles. The message could not have been clearer. The future of the automobile is no longer in the United States. The future is African. For years, Asia's automakers have complained quietly about U.S. tariffs, labor costs, and endless regulatory red tape. But the real breaking point came when American policymakers attempted to strong-arm them into building even more plants in the United States under the threat of additional tariffs and sanctions. Instead of bowing to Washington's pressure, these automakers looked south to Africa and saw a continent bursting with potential. Africa today is home to 1.4 billion people, with a rapidly growing middle class hungry for cars, motorcycles, buses, and trucks. Roads are being paved at record speeds, cities are expanding, and governments are investing heavily in infrastructure. What once was dismissed as a risk market is now the hottest automotive opportunity on Earth, and the deal these automakers have struck is nothing short of revolutionary. African governments have offered massive tax breaks, free trade zones, land grants for factories, and a young, skilled labor force ready to work. In exchange, these companies have committed to transfer technology, train local engineers, and source at least 40% of their parts from African suppliers within the next 5 years. The result? African cities like Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg are about to become the new Detroits of the world. Thousands of jobs will be created across the continent, from assembly line workers to designers, software engineers, and logistics managers. Meanwhile, the United States is bracing for economic pain. In Michigan alone, entire towns depend on auto factories for survival. Every closure ripples through the community, hitting suppliers, restaurants, shops, schools, and local governments. Washington is terrified because they know that this is not just about cars, it is about losing leverage over global trade. American media is scrambling to spin the story. Some networks are blaming unfair competition. Others are accusing African governments of stealing jobs. But the truth is that the U.S. did this to itself. For decades, it treated Africa as an afterthought, a place to dump used cars, not to build new ones. It invested in wars, not factories. It shipped charity, not capital. And now, when Africa finally has a chance to industrialize, the U.S. is shocked that it is no longer the first choice for business. Let us be clear, this is not just an economic shift. This is a symbolic one. For the first time in history, 5 of Asia's biggest corporations chose Africa over America. They did not just open a branch office, they moved their entire production strategy. This is a direct vote of confidence in Africa's future. Africa is not just winning jobs, it is winning respect. Picture what this means in practical terms. In just 3 years, African-made cars will be rolling out of brand new factories, stamped made in Africa and shipped to global markets. Those cars will compete head-to-head with American and European models. They will be cheaper, faster to produce, and in many cases more technologically advanced because these factories are being built with cutting-edge equipment and AI automation from the ground up. This is what terrifies Washington. This is what terrifies Detroit. Once Africa becomes a major car exporter, the United States will lose one of its last strongholds of global manufacturing leadership. But beyond the economics, this decision is about power. By choosing Africa, these automakers have aligned themselves with a continent that is determined to break free from the West's shadow. They have tied their future to a place where the population is young, innovation is rapid, and governments are increasingly independent of Washington's dictates, the symbolism of holding the press. Conference in Addis Ababa, the seat of the African Union, cannot be overstated. It was as if these automakers were saying, "We believe in Africa's collective destiny." And Africans are responding with pride. Social media is flooded with celebratory posts. Hashtags like hashtag Drive Africa, hashtag Madine Africa, and hashtag Goodbye Detroit are trending worldwide. For millions of young Africans, this is not just news, it is a moment of vindication. A moment that says, we are no longer just consumers, we are producers. We are innovators. What does this mean for the future of global geopolitics? It means that the old power centers are losing their grip. The global south is no longer begging for investment, it is choosing which investors get to participate. It means that the very concept of emerging markets is dead. Africa has emerged. For decades, the West lectured Africa about good governance and investment readiness. Now it is Asia's automakers who are teaching the world. A lesson: Africa is ready, and those who ignore it will be left behind. This shift is going to change everything. It will change trade routes, shipping lanes, and commodity flows. It will change where the next generation of engineers and designers are trained. It will change the balance of power in global boardrooms, and let us be honest, it will also change politics in Washington. 50,000 jobs gone is not just an economic statistic, it is a political earthquake. It means angry voters in swing states. It means congressional hearings. It means calls for tariffs, sanctions, and perhaps even attempts to sabotage African trade deals. But here is the truth: there is nothing Washington can do to stop this wave. This is not a decision made by one company that can be bullied into submission. This is 5 major corporations, representing multiple nations, making a long-term strategic pivot. The U.S. cannot sanction them all without triggering a global trade war it cannot win. In the coming months, you will see a flurry of activity. You will see African presidents cutting ribbons at new construction sites. You will see bulldozers clearing land for massive industrial parks. You will see the first hiring fairs for young African graduates. And you will see the United States scramble to respond with offers, incentives, and maybe even threats. But the momentum has shifted. The psychological victory has been won. The message to the world is clear. Africa is not the periphery anymore. It is the center of the next industrial revolution, and for every factory that closes in Michigan, there will be a new one opening in Lagos or Addis Ababa. For every American worker who loses a job, an African worker gains one. For every dollar lost in Detroit, a dollar is invested in Accra. This is a redistribution of opportunity on a global scale, and it is just beginning. This is why the West is panicking. This is why the headlines are screaming. Because deep down, they know that this is not a temporary relocation, it is a permanent shift. The age of Africa as a passive market is over. The age of Africa as an industrial powerhouse has begun. When the announcement hit American news networks, the first reaction was denial. Commentators insisted that this was just a bargaining tactic, that the automakers would eventually be forced back to the U.S. under political pressure. But within days, images of bulldozers and groundbreaking ceremonies began flooding social media from Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, and South Africa. Entire communities were celebrating in Africa while shock and grief spread across the Midwest in the United States. In Detroit, a city that has spent decades trying to recover from industrial decline, workers were stunned. Many of them had believed that the recent surge in EV subsidies and manufacturing tax credits would keep the automakers locked into the U.S. economy for years to come. But those subsidies could not compete with Africa's package. Nearly free land, ultra-cheap energy from hydroelectric dams and solar farms, and access to a workforce that is not only cheaper but younger and willing to innovate. This is the part Washington doesn't want to admit. This is not just about wages. Africa is not simply a cheaper labor market, it is a smarter one. The continent has been quietly investing in technical education, engineering universities, and research partnerships with China, India, and Europe. Young African engineers are graduating. In record numbers, many of them trained abroad and returning home with expertise that rivals their peers anywhere in the world. These new factories are not sweatshops, they are state-of-the-art facilities designed for robotics, electric vehicle assembly, and AI-driven supply chains. When Hyundai announced that its new Lagos plant would produce Africa's first fully electric SUV designed entirely on the continent, it sent a message to the world. Africa will no longer just build cars for others, it will design and innovate for itself. And with local demand exploding, these factories won't even need to rely solely on exports. The African consumer market is projected to be worth over $2.5 trillion by 2030, and car ownership rates are expected to double in the next decade. This is exactly what scares Washington. If Africa becomes self-sufficient in vehicle production, it will stop importing millions of used cars from the US and Europe, a trade that has been quietly propping up Western auto markets for decades. The used car export business is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it is about to collapse as Africans opt for brand new, locally made vehicles. Let's not forget the geopolitical implications. These deals were not just signed with corporations, they were signed with governments. Memorandums of understanding were exchanged between African states and Asian nations, creating a network of cooperation that bypasses Washington entirely. In essence, what we are seeing is the birth of a new global supply chain that runs from Asia to Africa, leaving the U.S. out in the cold. Imagine what happens when these African-made cars begin to dominate other markets in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and even Europe. Prices will drop, competition will heat up, and American automakers will struggle to compete. Already, Ford and General Motors are facing declining market share at home. Losing ground in Africa could be the death blow to their long-term survival. And this is just the beginning. The auto industry is often the first to industrialize in emerging economies because it creates a ripple effect from steel production to rubber, glass, electronics, and logistics. As these factories ramp up, Africa will also begin producing its own batteries, wiring harnesses, and chips, reducing its dependence on imports from Asia and the West. Consider the battery revolution. Right now, cobalt from the Congo is shipped to China for processing, then used in battery manufacturing for EVs in Asia, Europe, and the US under these new deals. Much of that cobalt will stay in Africa. New refineries are being built in Zambia and the DRC to process critical minerals locally, meaning that the value chain and the profits will remain on the continent. This is a strategic nightmare for Washington, which has spent years trying to secure these minerals for its own green transition. The U.S. response so far has been clumsy. Threats of tariffs have been met with calm defiance from African leaders, who know that the U.S. cannot afford to alienate a continent that holds so many of the resources it needs. Talk of sanctions has been quietly dropped because no one in Washington wants to risk pushing Africa further into the arms of China and Russia. Instead, you are seeing a desperate PR campaign. American officials are flying to African capitals, offering new aid packages and trade deals in an attempt to slow the tide. But this is too little, too late. Africa remembers decades of empty promises, exploitative contracts, and one-sided trade agreements. This time, it is setting. The terms and the automakers are listening. The social impact of this shift is just as profound. In Africa, entire generations who once dreamed of migrating to Europe or America are now seeing a future at home. High-paying factory jobs, engineering careers, and opportunities in logistics and technology are creating hope. For the first time in modern history, Africa is becoming a destination for skilled workers rather than a source of cheap labor. Contrast this with what is happening in the U.S. In the Rust Belt, the announcement has reignited debates over automation, globalization, and the hollowing out of American manufacturing. Political candidates are seizing on the issue, blaming everything from free trade agreements to foreign governments. But the uncomfortable truth is that this was not forced upon America, it was chosen. For decades, corporate leaders prioritized short-term shareholder profits over long-term investment in infrastructure and workers. They allowed factories to age, skills to erode, and communities to decline. Africa simply offered a better deal, and for once, the corporations took the long view. This is why the shock is so great. For the U.S., this is not just a job loss story, it is a status loss story. It is a reminder that America no longer controls the flow of global capital the way it once did. In the 20th century, if America sneezed, the world caught a cold. In the 21st century, Africa can sneeze and America will be the one reaching for tissues. We are watching a rebalancing of power that has been decades in the making. It is messy, it is disruptive, and it is unstoppable. Even Wall Street knows it. Analysts are already downgrading U.S. automaker stocks and warning of African competition. Risk in their reports. Hedge funds are pouring money into African infrastructure funds, betting that the next decade of growth will come from Nairobi and Accra, not from Detroit. And here is where it gets even more interesting. This wave will not stop with automobiles. Once the auto industry proves that Africa can deliver world-class manufacturing at scale, other industries will follow: electronics, pharmaceuticals, even aerospace. The same factors that attracted automakers: cheap energy, young talent, and massive domestic demand will attract everyone else. This is why the U.S. is worried, because what just happened with 5 automakers could soon happen with dozens of other industries. And let's be honest, this is good for Africa. It is good for the world. We are witnessing the beginning of a multipolar economy where no single nation can hold everyone else hostage. Africa is asserting itself, and for the first time, corporations are listening. Africa has not just gained a contract, it has gained leverage. It has not just secured jobs, it has secured destiny. This move by 5 of Asia's largest automakers was not merely a business decision. It was a declaration that Africa has entered the global economic chessboard not as a pawn, but as a kingmaker. For decades, America dictated the rules, deciding which nations would industrialize, which would remain raw material suppliers, and which would stay poor. But today, it is Africa that is dictating the terms. This is the new reality that Washington refuses to accept. The era of one-sided dependence is over. Think about what this moment symbolizes: 50,000 American jobs gone. Not because Africa begged for them, but because Africa built the conditions to attract them. This is no accident. This is the product of years of planning, investment, and a vision that said, Africa will no longer be the last chapter of globalization, we will be the first chapter of a new economic order, and make no mistake. The automakers saw this clearly. They saw that Africa is not just cheap labor. It is the youngest continent, the fastest growing market, and the future of innovation. They saw that Africa is where you build if you want to win in the 21st century. And so, they packed up from the U.S. heartland, they turned their backs on Washington's empty promises, and they planted their flags in Africa. What does this mean for America? It means panic. It means congressional hearings, angry op-eds, and corporate lobbying campaigns to bring jobs back. But the truth is, the jobs aren't coming back. The future isn't coming back. You cannot bribe the clock to turn back time. You cannot sanction the future into staying in Detroit. And here's the bigger picture: these auto plants are just the beginning. When Africa starts producing its own vehicles at scale, it will also produce its own parts, its own batteries, its own chips, its own software. The entire value chain will be African-owned. That means more factories, more universities, more research hubs. It means Africa will not just participate in the global economy, it will drive it. And that is what frightens Washington. Because if Africa can keep its wealth at home, if it can create jobs for its own youth, if it can feed its own markets, then it no longer needs to rely on U.S. aid, U.S. credit, or U.S. approval. Africa becomes truly sovereign politically, economically, and technologically. You can already feel the shift. African leaders are walking into summits with their heads held high. They are no longer begging for crumbs, they are negotiating as equals. They are telling foreign powers, if you want access to our markets, you will play fair. If you want our resources, you will refine them here. If you want our loyalty, you will respect our sovereignty. This is not just about jobs, it is about dignity. It is about rewriting centuries of exploitation. For too long, Africa's story was written by colonizers, by multinationals, by outside powers. But this time, Africa holds the pen. This time, Africa writes the story, and it writes a story of strength, not victimhood. So, to every young African listening today, this is your moment. The world is moving, and it is moving in your direction. You no longer have to leave your homeland to find opportunity. Opportunity is coming to you. Factories are rising, research labs are opening, new cities are being built, and you are the generation that will run them, design for them, and profit from them. And to America, listen carefully. This is not an attack. This is not revenge. This is the consequence of choices made over decades. You treated Africa as a place to extract from, not to invest in. You saw its people as cheap labor, not as future partners. You ignored the calls for fair trade, for value addition, for respect. And now, the world has moved on without you. The auto industry was the heart of your 20th century power. But if you cannot adapt, it will be the heart of your 21st century decline. And the nations that you once called developing will develop faster than you can keep up. This is Africa's century. This is the rebirth of a continent that has been underestimated for too long. The factories rising in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Addis Ababa are not just producing cars, they are producing freedom. Economic freedom, political freedom, psychological freedom from the idea that Africa must wait for someone else's permission to rise. 50,000 jobs lost in America may seem like a tragedy, and for those families, it is. But for 50 million young Africans, it is the first sign that the global system is finally bending toward justice. So let the world watch, let Washington panic, let Wall Street tremble, because a new engine is roaring to life, and it is not powered by Detroit, it is powered by Africa. The next decade will be decisive. Africa must stay united, protect its gains, and demand that every deal creates value at home. If it does, the continent will not just catch up, it will lead. And one day soon, when the world looks for where the future is being built, it will not look to Silicon Valley or Tokyo, it will look to Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, and Johannesburg. The wheels of history are turning, and this time, Africa is in the driver's seat.